If you want to produce great photography, sharpening is something you need to apply to most images. Despite this, many photographers find sharpening an image challenging, and over-sharpening is a common problem. So in this video, we're looking at the tricky question of how much sharpening is too much. But before we can answer that, there are a few things that we need to cover. The first of these is why we need to sharpen our photos in the first place. Probably the most obvious answer to this is that our photos look soft if we don't. There's something about a sharp photo that grabs and holds a viewer's attention. People also equate sharpness with quality, even if they aren't photographers. But there are other reasons for sharpening images too. A good example is a photo like this, where we use sharpening to direct attention towards specific areas of the image. In this photo you can see that I've also added some blur in Lightroom to shift attention away from the background. Using sharpening and blur creates a sense of depth in an image, and, as we can see here, it separates the subject from the background. If I remove the additional background blur, the image loses some of its interest. That's because as humans, we're conditioned to focus on detail. Photographers have been using this valuable tool since the early days of photography, and it's a way to direct the viewer's attention. The next reason for sharpening is to ensure the image appears sharp when printed or displayed on a screen. When we reduce the size of an image to post it on a website or share it on social media, we affect its sharpness because we shrink the sharpening halos that produce the effect. Something similar also happens when we print an image. Ink applied to a paper never appears as sharp as pixels on a screen, so we need to add additional sharpness to compensate. Now, I need to mention something that's probably very controversial and that a lot of people will disagree with. I don't recommend sharpening as a fix for blurred photos, despite what the AI sharpening tools claim. Yes, they can be impressive and they can fix images with serious problems to a degree, but they also tend to leave telltale signs that something isn't quite right with the image. Because of this, I don't think sharpening to fix a blurred image is something that we should use, and it should be treated as an exception and a last resort. With that out of the way, we also need to discuss when to sharpen in our workflow, because it's critical to answering the question of how much sharpening is too much. If you've been interested in photography for a while, you may know about the 3-stage sharpening model. This identifies 3 types of sharpening that we can apply to an image, each with a different objective. The first is called capture sharpening. It's intended to compensate for the softening effect that digital capture can have on an image. Let's look at an example with this image. Here's the original image now magnified at 100% without any sharpening applied. It's reasonable, but we can see it's slightly soft. Now compare this to the version generated using DxO Pure Raw. I used Pure Raw to process the raw file by applying deep prime noise reduction and lens softness correction. Other than that, identical adjustments have been applied to both images. In the Pure Raw version that's had the lens softness correction applied, the detail stands out much more. This is an example of applying capture sharpening, and it should be done early in our editing work, usually as part of the raw conversion. When we apply capture sharpening, it's important to avoid introducing sharpening artifacts. Even faint sharpening halos can become visible later as they become exaggerated by more processing. When applying capture sharpening, best to work with the image magnified at 100%. This helps you to spot and correct any problems. Remember, only apply enough sharpening to correct any softness at this stage. You're not trying to bring out lots of detail and texture in the image. The next type of sharpening is creative sharpening. This is where we apply additional sharpening to some areas of the image and possibly blur others. As we've already discussed, the objective is to direct the viewer's attention. With this image, I've applied a small amount of lens blur to the background, but nothing more. Typically, we apply this sharpening towards the end of our editing, after adjusting the colours and contrast in the image. Then the final type of sharpening is called output sharpening. This is intended to compensate for any softening effect of output. A good example of this is if we want to share an image on Instagram. For that, the image needs to be 1080 pixels on the long edge, but this image is currently around 5000 pixels. If we reduce the size of this image, it won't appear as sharp because the sharpening is also reduced and it won't be as clear. That's why output sharpening should be the final step in our workflow. It's applied only after the image is resized. A similar problem can also occur when we enlarge an image. Sharpening that wasn't obvious in a small image can become magnified and appear ugly when we enlarge it. So, with that out of the way, let's try to answer the question of how much sharpening is too much. To do that, we'll apply some more sharpening to this image, which has already had capture sharpening applied. To do this, I'm using Photoshop because it's easy to see what's happening, but other software will have similar controls. First, I'll zoom to 100% to see the detail in the rock. To apply the sharpening, I'm using the Unsharp Mask filter on a duplicate layer in the image. The Unsharp Mask has been around for a long time, but it's still a good sharpening tool. If I turn the preview off and on, you can see the effect it produces in this image. To control the strength of the sharpening effect, we use the amount slider. At low levels the effect is good, but look what happens when I increase it. We begin to see lighter pixels in the image turning white. When we see this effect, we've applied too much sharpening. What's happening is that the sharpening enhances the contrast between adjacent pixels so that some pixels become darker and others lighter. The level of contrast enhancement is controlled by the amount slider. When we apply too much, it causes some lighter pixels to turn white, and whilst it's not obvious in this image, some of the darker pixels are also turning black. Let's set the amount to 100% now so we can look at the effect of the radius slider. This controls how wide an area is sharpened by the amount slider. Watch what happens now as I increase the radius. We start to see the edges around things like the lichens on this rock become more obvious. If we look at the rocks on the horizon now, we also see a halo around the edges. This is a sharpening halo, and it's what makes objects in the image appear sharper. But when the halo becomes clearly visible like this, they become distracting, and that's when you know you've applied too strong a setting. But at lower radius settings, this halo effect isn't obvious, other than it makes things look sharper. This may tempt you into always using a low radius, but that isn't necessarily the best option. You see, we need to combine the three controls here to produce a sharpening effect that suits the needs of the image. All of these controls can produce a sharpening effect that could be considered too strong. So let's look at the final setting, threshold, which controls which areas of the image are being sharpened. Photoshop identifies the pixels to sharpen by comparing the contrast between pixels to detect edges. The threshold slider controls how sensitive Photoshop is and how different the pixel brightness must be in order for them to be sharpened. When the setting is at 0, every pixel in the image becomes sharpened. But when I move the threshold slider to the far right, I can even remove the sharpening effect altogether. Usually choosing to sharpen every pixel in an image applies too much sharpening to it. If we look at the effect on this area of clear blue sky, we can see that the camera sensor pattern becomes visible, which we don't want. In other words, we're applying too much sharpening. So the answer to the question of how much sharpening is too much is when the sharpening effect becomes distracting. That level depends on several factors, not just the settings we've applied in our software. Other factors, such as how closely we view an image, are also important. For example, a large image viewed at 100% magnification may show signs of sharpening. But this image isn't intended for viewing closely in this way. It's intended for printing as a 30-inch print. At that size, the sharpening you see here becomes invisible. Also, we need to apply output sharpening to compensate for the softening effect of the printing. When we do that, we need to consider things like the print size and the likely viewing distance of the print. Correctly applying print sharpening to this image would make it appear over-sharpened if we viewed it at 100% magnification. As I'm sure you can imagine, this quickly becomes complicated. So if you want to know my solution, watch this video next. Thanks for watching today, and I hope you found the video useful. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope to see you soon for another video.